Yep, everyone, welcome back to the War Room for a bit of an interesting look at acceptable breaks from reality. Or what I'm really going to be talking about is this idea of gameplay, realism, balance. So, over the weekend, General Sranti and I hopped back onto the Arma 3 Tactical Battlefield mod server, which is this footage that you're seeing in the background. And it kind of got me thinking about games and perceptions of realism and how they kind of fit together. TACBF is an interesting kind of beast. It's basically like someone's tried to pick up Project Reality and shoehorn it somehow into Arma and try and get the best of both worlds. But in a lot of ways it doesn't really work, and it frequently feels like it's got the worst elements of Arma and the worst elements of stuff like Project Reality and Squad. And it can be a real grind to play. But on the flip side, there are some fantastic moments in it, which are a lot of fun. And when you actually accomplish something, it's extremely rewarding. So, jury's out a bit. If you want to look, I'll leave a link down in the description. The servers are pretty empty these days. But as you can see here, we are sat on an aircraft carrier waiting. And basically it's a beach landing with helicopter movement involved. It's called Operation Chromite, something like that. We've joined a squad and we've had to get on the right radio channel, and we've had a little briefing which we couldn't hear because there was helicopters in the background, and we're hanging around. And anybody who has been in the army will tell you that hanging around waiting for things to happen takes up about 90% of your time. So, in a sense, this is realistic, but it's not very good gameplay because we're just sat here waiting. And we sit here waiting for quite a long time. Realism does not necessarily translate instantly into fun. This is quite boring, really. Then we have all kinds of other perceptions of realism and how things work, which feed into the game and influence the way that people play it. So, for example, at one point our squad gets split up into separate fire teams. We have fire team leaders, we have the support team with the MG and the assault team, and previously in the past we've seen people playing in the distance, because we tend to try and stay as far away from these people as possible, doing things like stacking up to storm buildings, making sure they're in the right formation for crossing open ground, like arrowheads and things. The infamous tactical seagull. These things, which are easy to learn because they're out there in diagram format and things like field manuals, so in a sense are realistic, but a lot of people don't pick up on the nuance of actually using it. So something like stacking up and storming a building SWAT team style, the old breach and clear. Storming a building is literally the last thing you want to be doing if you're a soldier. It's ludicrously risky, extremely dangerous, and it really should be the option of last resort. And there are so many options to run through and problems to deal with before you get to the point where you, for example, stack up at the side of that building. And we've seen things before. Remember in the last War Room I talked about enfilade and defilade. If you're stacking up against the wall, obviously you are enfiladed to anybody at right angles for you, and I've certainly gunned down my fair share of stacks. It's very easy, it's a very good target, so not only do you have to worry about the target building you're trying to storm, but you have to worry about other buildings, other enemy positions all over the place. You also have to worry about, is the target building mined? Are there tripwires at the door? What happens if there are no enemies in the building but they've just filled it up with explosive charges, so when you storm it, the enemy destroy the building and kill you all? And of course, there are other options for attacking as well. You can also destroy the building, you don't need to go into it. If you go up to a blindsided wall, you can just set some explosive charges, destroy the place and bring it down. Or you could call a tank up, call up an attack helicopter and get it to hammer the building. So there are millions of options out there, and stacking up and actually moving in to physically clear the building is extremely dangerous, and if it's going to be successful it needs to be a small cog in a very intricate and complicated tactical machine, which, broadly speaking, is never ever ever present in public Arma gameplay. So you have elements of realism that can impinge on the gameplay because they're not properly represented. You don't have the whole thing backing it up that makes it work. And of course, when you get down to it, realism in warfare, tactical realism, is about making the fight as unfair in your advantage as physically possible. And there are obvious difficulties in fitting that into a multiplayer game where you have equal teams, equal sides, all the weapons have counters and things. Speaking of weapons and equipment, one of the things that we kept seeing in TACBF was the mission designers who were not technically part of the mod team, but really anybody who wanted to make a mission would put something like an Apache gunship in, or an Abrams tank, because it was cool. And then you'd have to balance it with, say, a Hind or a Havoc or a T-72 or a T-90, something like that. And suddenly the battlefield is covered in all kinds of what I'd call power trip vehicles, which is to say that most of the players on the battlefield in the game are going to be riflemen, infantry. What can they do against an attack helicopter? What can they do against a main battle tank? It essentially means that you have a few extremely powerful units rolling around the battlefield, making the game unpleasant for everybody else because it's a problem they can't deal with. The last thing you want is for the players playing the game to feel powerless. In my opinion, they should always have some kind of chance. So let's have a think about this scenario. You'll notice we still haven't actually done anything. We're still standing around on this aircraft carrier. What we're doing is essentially a beach assault. We've got a series of objectives to take. We've got 2 little piers to take over. There's 2 little villages beyond that. Then there is the Russian fortifications and their main base at the back. And obviously this is a kind of Saving Private Ryan experience, but with a few helicopters chucked in. And really, where's the tactical logic here? This is one of the things that winds me up. The fact is that this is such an artificial scenario determined by somebody's view of what's cool rather than any kind of tactical reality. So if you think about the layout of the terrain here, what's really important from a tactical perspective is the hills on either side of the mission area, because if you are trying to defend that little stretch of coastline, what you want is the elevation and the concealment from the woods on these hills. 2 strong points, 1 on each hill. You can just about mutually support them with long-range heavy weapons fire. You can dominate the coastline, you can dominate the villages. That's what you want. You don't have to sit directly on top of things to actually control them these days. You can do it with fire. So it makes more sense from a tactical perspective for the defenders to be defending the hills and the attackers to be attacking the hills. The real problem is that the objectives as they are in the mission have no tactical value on their own, especially, you know, if this is a US Marine task force or whatever attacking this little stretch of coastline. They really don't need 2 tiny little piers to get all their gear ashore, so that's not a big deal. The villages, who cares about the villages? They have no tactical value in and of themselves. Any of the ground that you would control by controlling those villages, you can also control if you control the hills, which are better positions in general. So there's not a lot of point actually attacking the villages. And this was something we saw on some of the other maps, especially places like Takistan. The mission makers were really obsessed with making the objectives almost like small close quarter combat arenas. So you'd have the villages as objectives or construction sites, and in some cases they go out of their way to build HESCO death traps or HESCO forts, little fort morons, and use them as objectives. And especially somewhere like Takistan, the villages don't have any particular tactical value, and what you would get is everybody would go up onto the hills, up onto the mountains, and there's a lot of criticism about people hill camping. But that's like the smartest tactical thing they should do. So there is a gap here between player behavior, the tactics that players would actually use, and what they needed to do to get results for gameplay purposes. So you kind of get this situation where in TACBF, certainly in most of the missions, the tactical part of it is kind of a bit of a myth, a bit of a lie. It's not very tactical at all. And more to the point, the 2 teams, Blue 4 and Op 4, were always unbalanced, because Blue 4 is probably over-organised and is really looking to work to their perceptions, whereas Op 4 has always been more about getting in and hitting the enemy and not giving them time to do that. And the real problem is that the game, or the real problem is that the mod kind of allows both approaches to coexist. So, if you want to move fast, you can move fast. If you want to move slow, you can move slow. If you want to be over-organised, you can be over-organised. If you're willing to work with the minimum of organisation, then you can work with the minimum of organisation. If you want to do nasty underhand things, nasty sensible underhand things rather, like mining the route out of the enemy's base, liberally sprinkling landmines everywhere you bloody well go, then you can do that because the options are there, because you've got that freedom from armor. And the upshot of all of this is that for TACBF at least, that's kind of where the friction develops between realism and gameplay. So that's a little quick roundup. That's basically just me thinking out loud for a little while about what I think about Tactical Battlefield, the Tactical Battlefield mod, and how realism kind of interfaces with games. You know, too much makes it boring, too little makes it uninteresting, and there's a bit of a balancing act to be done, not helped by the fact that everybody's got a different perception of what realism is and what they're trying to do with the game, what they're trying to get out of it. So hope you enjoyed that, guys, and I'll catch you in the next video. Hey, look, land! Isn't this great?